Exciting to be here, and the reason for being here actually came out of the run up to Christmas when there was a whole chat, and a really bright light, around should people buy power pedals, which for those who haven't seen power pedals, they look a bit like this if you go for the Garmin ones. You may have seen on some of the bikes, the Speedplay ones, and they probably in the region of £600 to £900 a set, so quite a big investment. And my goal tonight, if I'm honest, is to save you at least 600 quid and hopefully give you some real tools that will really help you. So the presentation was called Structured Power, which I think means structured training using power. And if I'm really honest, my goal is to help you improve your cycling, because actually that's what we all want to do, isn't it? But I should start off by saying, who am I? So although you've probably ridden with me, my background is I sort of stumbled into triathlon. I was a beach lifeguard as a kid up on the Northumberland coast, so did a bit of swimming in the sea and stuff like that, cycled to places because we didn't have a car for a bit of time and so on, and really hated running. So on the principle that when I was at work and trying to keep fit, everybody went running. I really like running, so at least if I do triathlon, there's not too much running. The hard bit is it's at the end, as you probably know. So some of these pictures involve quite a lot of running. Some of the crew will recognise Comrades. I did back-to-back Comrades in 2015, 2016, which is an ultra-marathon in South Africa where you run 90 kilometres from Durban to Pietermaritzburg, and the following year downhill, allegedly, from Pietermaritzburg to Durban, which you still climb over, I think, 1,000 metres that year, and you climb more than 2,000 the other year. So a lot of running, and then there's various kind of cycling bits, and that was the first Ironman I did in Wales. Again, following a theme, didn't quite realise how hilly Wales was going to be as a first Ironman. Should have done a bit more research. And then qualified for European World Championships for triathlon. So that's been a lot of my kind of background. And then, as many of you know, I had a freak accident about 5 years ago, which left me going through surgeries for about 2 years, and I lost all sensation in this right leg, so I couldn't walk other than with a stick, and had to do a lot of rehab and so on, and so did a lot more coaching as I kind of came back from that, and that's what got me to here. So in terms of why have I got any right to talk to you, there are a number of obviously brilliant coaches in the club. Holly, as you know, is rocking it out in the Canaries at the moment, and if you're not following our Instagram, well, you'll turn green with envy every morning, but it's worth it, isn't it? And then, of course, we've got Charlie, who does loads of coaching as well, and I'm sure there are other coaches and personal trainers through the club. But my background is, as I said, I'm a personal trainer and specialise in corrective exercise, so that's particularly coming back from injuries and challenges, which really interests me, and one or two of the examples that I'll show you involve some of that. Then I'm a triathlon coach, a running coach, a bike lead, and then Training Peaks, which some of you I know used in the preparation to Banyolis last year, and I think it's a really great platform and also a great community for coaches actually. And then I've also been a non-exec director for Commonwealth Games, obviously most recently with Birmingham, but through the previous cycles in Australia and before that in Glasgow. And also done quite a bit in terms of running events and so on through park runs, which many of you do, I know, and so on. So that's a little bit about me. But the question I've got for you, and why you've got a bit of paper, is, not that, there, what do you want for your cycling? What is it that you brought you here tonight, right? Come out of home and could be sat watching something brilliant on the TV. What is it that you want? So have a little think, maybe write it down. It might be how you feel when you get to the coffee stop, it might be how you feel out on the road, it might be a particular goal. I know there's some people in the club who are training for their first century ride, with the London Essex ride coming up. So I'll give you a minute or two to think. I really want to. Oh yes, yes. It can, and I know in the club there's a few people who are training for marathon and then the London 100, aren't they? And they're saying, how do I balance training for two things. Brilliant. Anyone care to share a goal or a feeling? Or?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Yeah, brilliant.
I'm going to swear.
Yeah, go on.
To get up those bloody hills.
Is that the truth?
Honestly.
Excellent.
Seriously.
Up those hills. Brilliant. We will talk about hills. Excellent. Anyone else? Go on.
How to pedal and change gear efficiently. I find that I lose a lot of power when either I'm not going spinning fast enough, and then when I change gear, I don't know. There must be a science behind all that, and I don't really know.
Brilliant. Excellent. Really good one. Anybody else? Yeah, go on.
A bit faster on the flat.
Faster on the flat.
Some people hurtling along and I'm
Yeah.
pulling like fury and I can't keep up.
Yeah. Great.
Better bike handling skills.
Bike handling. Excellent. And what kind of things in particular?
I want to learn how to bunny hop
Hey, excellent.
and get a curve.
Oh yeah.
And
Bunny
sometimes
hops
I
and
can do it,
curves.
sometimes I can't.
Excellent. Puppetson, here we come.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bit endurance.
Endurance.
Yeah, I've got endurance down.
Excellent. And what sort of distances are you looking for endurance? Or times?
Just better.
Better, yeah.
So I'm comfortable with the club rides. But I just find like
Beyond the 2 hours mark, yeah.
I
Yeah.
start to feel fidgety. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, the good news is, what a relief.
Yeah.
I think we're going to cover most of those, is the absolute relief. And who here would say already that they follow some kind of training plan or some kind of structure? Anybody? Yeah? And do you train to power, or do you train to heart rate, or do you train to effort?
I do train to power. I have got power pedals on my bike, but to be fair, when I'm out on my bike, I'm usually just riding. If I'm doing training, certainly this time of year, I tend to do it inside. And I've got a coach that puts on my trainer and trainer peaks, and I run that through.
Excellent. So you can keep me honest when we look at some of the examples, because I think it's useful, even if you're never going to train to power. I think it's really useful to understand what people are talking about, and kind of know if you go to the velodrome what everyone's talking about and so on. It's just a very useful thing to know, even if you choose absolutely not to go there, and also to know how you can get pretty much 90% of the benefits without spending all that money. So that's the plan. So the bit that it leads into is, what are you going to train? Because what you do needs to link to your goal, right? And so if we are training to do essentially ride 100 miles, that's really different from doing 45 minutes of cyclocross off-road. Yeah, I mean, kind of immediately go, oh yeah, it's a different bike, it's going to be different terrain, it's going to be different duration, it's going to be a different energy system actually in terms of what we're using, and there are very different skills involved. So that's really what we're going to focus a little bit on. And if I just show you my master model, this when I kind of look at people's training challenges is how I try and break it down into the mix. If I just stand there so you can see it. The first block for me is around the cardiovascular system. So that's kind of your heart rate, yeah, can you just pump enough oxygen around your body? And that is something you can absolutely train. But breathing is also really important, how you breathe. And I often think that's something that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about and teaching our bodies to breathe, actually. And unfortunately, increasingly, we all get used to quite shallow breathing because we don't need to do much more than that. And actually, this is a really powerful system that can also help you to relax because it links to what's called the parasympathetic system, so that's the recovery system, and is really important. So that's kind of the first block, which links to some of these things, but more at a kind of a base level. And then you've got the muscular and the neuromuscular system, and we talked a bit about this, I think, didn't we, when David came in and talked about movement patterns, and a lot of that's biomechanics. I always love to watch people on the bike when I ride behind them and just look at kind of their shape on the bike, how much do the shoulders rock, you know, are they straight on the bike, to what extent are their shoulders relaxed. And so if you're coming back from rides and regularly feeling like, oh man, my upper body's so tight, that does suggest that you're holding your upper body tense. And that may be that you kind of don't feel confident about the steering and so on, but actually the irony is the faster you go, the more softly you want to hold the handlebars actually, because that gives you, weirdly, increased control. So there's all sorts of stuff around biomechanics. And then we touched on cadence, I think, a little bit here, in the pedalling and the gear changes. Cadence is the bit that I think most of us can make a step change improvement on in terms of getting what we want. And it is just a neuromuscular thing. When I first started trying to do spin-ups as part of warm-up and trying to get up to 130 rotations per minute, it's like, oh my God, I can't do this. But actually, you teach your body to do it, and once it learns it, you can spin everything up. And then the good news about that is you're just in a much more aerobic system rather than having to push and create lactic acid because you're pushing so hard with the muscles all the time. So that's one of the pieces that I often look at people and say, one of the things you might want to measure a bit more and look at is your cadence, because you can get a lot of benefits from it. And then the other one is pedal stroke, and we'll have a look a little bit later on at some of the diagnostics that you can get around pedal stroke in terms of where do you put the power on in the pedal, which is actually quite difficult to change as well. It changes over the long term. If you put those two blocks together, I think the outcome of those is power. So when you measure power, it's like, oh, okay, I'm getting all sorts of information about all of these things going on. But of course, if you're racing, and so if you listen to Jenny, I think from her racing days, she never used power, I don't think. Likewise, if you talk to most cyclocross riders, they train to power, so they know what power is, but in a racing environment, they never ever use it, because you know what? It's about handling the bike, chasing the person in front, and using your skills for speed rather than for power. So interestingly, I think in that speed area, I'm just standing here again so you'll see it, you've got a lot of things we were talking about, bike handling, so how do we get round and through things, and I think in club rides it's always really interesting. You'll generally see most clubs, all clubs, will go into corners faster than they come out of them. If you ride with people who ride a lot, they'll come out of corners faster than they went into them, and they use the corner to accelerate. And Sue and I actually went riding with someone the other day at Swindley, and she'd come 6th in the cyclocross championship. She was 14. Watching her ride was amazing. We earned our keep because we found her mobile phone when she dropped it. But apart from that, we didn't see a lot of her put it that way. But watching her bike handling was just sublime, and the way that she used the terrain to accelerate the bike without actually putting any power through the pedals at times. And then pacing, I think, is a really important one around endurance. And actually, if we look at most people, they'll start a long event much faster than they finish it, and ideally you want to kind of spread your effort. And then fueling is the other one that I think most of us are pretty bad at. Yeah, I mean, if we look at our own rides, we tend not to eat until we get to the coffee stop, which is probably a good hour and a half, hour and 3/4, 2 hours into a ride. And really we need a bit more than that in order to look after our bodies and get out of them what we need. And certainly when we get to century riding, then fueling is really, really, really important. And then psychology, I think, is a really important one as well, especially on hills, right? In hills, there's a bit of all of that. Breathing's really important. Biomechanics of actually our posture on the bike and therefore the hip angle, which we can talk a bit more about. Definitely psychology. And then the other bit is aerodynamics. So cycling is massively impacted by aerodynamics. And so kind of our position on the bike changes that a lot. And so if you're drafting or if you're in a tuck position, so literally the footprint that you're presenting, so the incoming air is smaller, you will just go faster. And likewise, there's various bits of kit and tom that can help you with aerodynamics. But all of that, if you like, is speed. And so you put those two bits together, and then the bit that's hard is you often add fatigue on top of it, right, because you're tired, and all this stuff gets harder when you're tired. And then if you're racing, of course, or you're trying to hit a particular time or a goal, then the pressure can also add another bit into it as well. So that, if you like, is my kind of master model that I kind of go, okay, what is it that we really want to work on in order to help you get to your goal? So maybe we just spend a little bit of time on the first one, because I think pretty much everybody wants to climb hills better, yeah? And say, what is it in here that we might think about that can help us on hills? What strikes you on the hill one? Go on.
Being in the right gear?
The right gear, isn't that the truth? Yeah. In good time, yeah?
Yes.
And that allows you to keep your cadence up, doesn't it? So actually you can go into a hill spinning quite fast, because that then gets you up that first bit, and you're going to be able to settle into the cadence that you're going to hold for all of the climb, rather than having your cadence that gear that you've been on, and then getting to the hill and slowly, by that time you're really like, oh, I can't move the blooming bike. Yeah. That's a really good one. Anything else?
Breathing.
Right. Yeah, breathing. Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of that is training our diaphragms to really work, yeah? And the bit that's hard about that is when we're in a tuck position, which at some level on the bike you're always flexed at some level. Yeah? You've got to teach your diaphragm when you've got some level of bracing, because obviously holding a bike like that has some level of abdominal bracing, and yet you want your diaphragm to move in a really nice, relaxed way. And there's quite a lot that you can do, again, back to the kind of work that David was talking about in the gym, actually, that can really help your diaphragm to get used to working well when it's under a certain amount of pressure, both in terms of cardiovascular pressure and also in terms of kind of stability, stabilising the body pressure. So breathing's a really big one as well, and getting that sort of, yeah. So we touched on breathing, we touched on cadence and gears. What else for hills?
Your body position as well, particularly when you are struggling.
Yeah. And the bit I would say for me is we really should routinely move around the handlebars. So if you know the three positions on the handlebars, yeah, there's on the tops, which is like that, yeah. Then there's on the hoods, where you go either side of the hoods that are the brake hoods, and then there's on the drops, which is there. So when we might be coming along on the flat and going pretty fast, we might be on the drops, yeah? Then as we start to see the hill, we might come up to the hoods, because we're kind of getting ready. But whenever we're climbing, we really should be on the tops. And the reason for that is it opens out the hip angle, and that gives us just a lot more power into that kind of pedal stroke as we go. So getting into the right position and holding the right position can really help. And again, doing that in good time so that you're kind of in the right position, and moving through the gears so that you feel balanced and so on. Yeah.
So that's obviously if you're in a seated position.
Yes,
If you stand
exactly.
up to go up the hill, what
Yeah.
would your advice be?
I'd still absolutely go on the tops, because that's giving you the maximum height. The more you can open out the hip flexors, the more power that gives you, because it allows your glutes to work really well. And that's where a lot of the power in the pedal stroke actually comes from, is kind of the back mechanics rather than the front mechanics. And unfortunately, most of us tend to be quite quad dominant, which is why you'll often feel when you get home and need to foam roll the quads and the calves, because we're quite quad dominant. And particularly when we start to look at on the watt bike, you can start to see what quad dominance looks like in terms of your pedal stroke. It means that you're missing quite a bit of the power that you can get through the stroke. Whereas if you can get your glutes and your hamstrings engaged, that'll help you use a lot more of the cycle and the pedal stroke to drive power for you.
What about standing for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has their favourites, and so I think there's definitely value in working out what works for you. And so if you watch the pros, some of them will climb out of the saddle most of the time, some of them will hardly ever climb out of the saddle. I think it stems from where you learned, and so I think a lot of people who maybe come from more of a mountain biking and so on background tend to sit in the saddle, but it's really about where you can put out the most power in a way that is the least strain on your cardiovascular system. And so if any of you watched the Cyclocross World Championships, you saw the winner actually is very good at seated power. One of her kind of key capabilities is just power in a seated position, whereas other people will stand up and drive much more. But I would think for everybody, even if you do have a preference for seated power, which I personally do, there are definitely times where coming out of the seat for at least 20 pedal strokes, it gives you a rest. Because if you're climbing, an 8% or a 10% hill for an hour, you do need a rest. And also it just mixes up which muscle groups you use and so on. So on long hills, I would always say alternate in and out of the saddle, because it just gives the muscles a bit of a break, and the movement pattern, which can start to get a bit kind of ingrained after long climbs. Brilliant. And then I think the other one which we'll come to is there is an element of cardiovascular training for hills. As you said, it's kind of like so it'll take you into a different energy system when you climb, and we will actually use hills as an example of what the different measures look like in a minute. Brilliant. Do we want to take another one and have a little kind of think about it? Which one should we do? What, faster on the flat do you want to do, or yeah?
Yeah.
So what do you think is part of the story of faster on the flat? Position, right. So there's a lot of aerodynamics at play. So where would you be in terms of position? Yeah, on the drops, and ideally third wheel. So that everyone in front of you is still working much harder than you are. And then hoping that you can do that last minute sprint round them for the side. Yeah, so definitely on the flats. And so that might be the story. When you see people around you who look like they're going much easier, they might just be sitting in behind somebody. And then they can literally be freewheeling. Yeah, I mean, there's times because the two of us have a really loud freewheel. I'm always really conscious when we're sat at second and third wheel because it's kind of like, oh, everyone can hear we're not pedaling. But yeah, that's definitely a factor. Is drafting or body position is a big one. What else helps? Cadence, yeah. And so what cadence would you aim for?
900 if I get
Yeah. Right, so if you're kind of up at the racing end and you're a comfortable high spinner, you'd definitely be in the 90 to 100. I definitely think everybody should be aiming for over 80 on a flat. And I think most of us probably in our cycling career start at around 55, right? Which is a really normal thing. So it's about teaching the body to move up into that. And I think you can do that in a couple of ways. One is you can do it actually kind of on the stationary trainer and watching it and so on because it's measured. The other bit that's really worthwhile is to buy a cadence meter, which kind of looks like a bit like that, just goes around the pedal, and it's just a sensor. It will talk to your bike computer and it will give you cadence reading. They're about 15 quid, 20 quid, something like that, and it's super useful data, yeah. And then you've just got to strictly watch it and move down a gear, because routinely, I was definitely routinely at 70 when I first started, and you kind of go, oh, didn't realise that. And so you just get in the habit of spinning, and it is back to the neuromuscular system, getting the system comfortable with that, and then you get to a stage where you don't need to look at the numbers anymore because your body is in that groove. But I don't know whether anybody else has done that kind of training, or you've had to, yeah. How long did it take you to get your body to get used to it? Quite a while, yeah.
If you don't
I was
consciously-
riding with my son, who was a lot younger, obviously. And
Right,
we were just doing static training.
right,
And it was like, I'm changing gear. And he's like,
right,
but it's just, also as an age thing, I think. You
yeah.
know, depends when you started.
When you started, yeah, we were kind of taught to stamp on the pedals, weren't we? Yeah.
Well, not just that, but so I came into riding a bike like this like 10 years ago. So, you know, I haven't grown up riding it. I
Right,
used to ride a bike to school, but not,
Yeah.
you know, road bike.
yeah, yeah,
So, it's different.
yeah, it is different, yeah. How about you, Seth? What?
I was going to say you can get very lazy and it drops very easily,
Doesn't it?
and you have to consciously think about it. And
Yeah.
I know I tend to increase my cadence over the winter because I'm using the watt bike more.
Ah,
Because
how
I'm looking
interesting.
at it. Whereas if I'm riding with people, I don't think about it as much,
Yeah.
and it will dip and become slower.
Mm.
It's definitely one of the things that I have on my road is my cadence.
One of the things, and we'll come on to what you keep on your computer. So I think there's two bits. One is cadence is something I would always look at on every ride when I get home. Not necessarily during the ride, but when I look back over a ride, I always look at what's my average cadence for the ride, and kind of decide whether I need to give myself a ticking off or not. And then what's my average heart rate for the ride, and did I broadly stay in the energy system that I wanted to stay in. But those two bits, I think, as post-ride analysis, even if you just spend 5 seconds looking back over the ride, are the two things that I really think tell you a lot, and can just help you fine-tune. Because as Seb said, the danger is that we go out and ride and have a lovely time with our friends, which is absolutely what riding's about. But then if we're frustrated that we're not getting the results we want, then we've got to just look back and kind of go, oh, why would that be? And sometimes it just is that the body just drifts into what's comfortable and easier. The body's brilliant at finding the easiest possible way to do things.
But also when you say kit, there is something to having really good bearings in your wheels.
Bearings, yeah.
Because that really does, you'll notice the difference if you have a high quality bearing than if you don't.
Yeah, if you're saving
It's so
600
much
quid on not buying
so
pedals,
much easier to
wheels.
ride,
Yeah.
just kind of glide along.
That is so
and,
true.
And if you find people are riding away from you, that may also be part of it.
Yeah.
The kit.
Kit.
And I know everybody can't afford expensive, but if we can go maybe one level up from what you've got, you'll notice the difference is incredible
Yeah,
on the roll of your bike.
Mm.
if someone's got a carbon bike and you're on aluminium, you're not going to
Yeah,
necessarily.
exactly. So there's a weight piece on the frame, and then, as you say, the wheels. If you're going to spend money, I'd say wheels is just often underestimated. I think you rightly make the point. Yeah. Lovely. So that gives you a little sense of the master model, if you like. But I thought we'd come back a little bit more and get into that. So how do I really measure it? You know, if I'm out on the road, primarily, I'm doing relatively little on the stationary bikes like we were doing for the Kilometre Collective. How do I actually know whether I'm getting what I want? And so I thought we'd have a little look at what the usual measures are and how they compare. So I don't know whether we want to in fact, why don't we jump straight into my little hill example, because this is quite good fun. So this is me on my bike with this awful hill coming up. And I just thought it'd be useful to pick up speed, cadence, relative perceived effort, so how hard does it feel, heart rate and power, and just have a think about, one by one, what those might look like. So I'm going to stand here with my pen and you guys can tell me what it's going to look like. So here we go, my speed, I would say I'm tracking along quite nicely, so I'm flying along and I get to the base of the hill. What's going to happen to speed? Right, so my speed's going and then I might crawl over the top, so it depends whether I've got any energy left at the top, and then eventually finally get going. Yeah? And then my speed's going to go all the way back up as I descend, and then eventually it's going to kind of plateau off and probably drop again down to somewhere broadly, maybe a bit faster because the momentum I built up. So speed kind of gives us one set of measures, but not necessarily a helpful set of measures. Cadence, what's going to happen to cadence of going along? So assuming I'm doing well, assuming I'm having a good day and I'm kind of at, say, 90 coming along, so here's my cadence at 90, what's going to happen? It's going to go down, isn't it? With the best one in the world, even as I kind of change down gears and so on. So I might manage to maintain it for a bit, it might not drop quite so fast and quite so far. And then it's probably going to flatline, isn't it? Because I'm probably going to freewheel down the hill, so it's going to go right way down and do nothing. And then I'm going to come back up. So cadence kind of tells me some stuff, but not necessarily immediately helpful. How about my perceived effort? What does it feel like? I'm on the flat and say I'm going along kind of 6 out of 10. It's kind of alright, trucking along. What happens then? Right, so it's like, oh no, the effort,
Minus 20,
the effort. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So awful effort. And then it's going to go right down to no effort at all, right down freewheeling, and then it's going to kind of eventually come back up somewhere here. So, okay, that kind of gives me something. And what happens to heart rate? Right, so here we go. Yeah, so here we go. I'm kind of quite high maybe, and then it's going to go super high, isn't it, as I come up. And then actually it's going to stay high as I descend because it's going to take me a while to recover. So I'm still, even though I'm completely freewheeling and it's just starting to come down, it's going to stay high. And then eventually it might come down, but it might not, yeah. And the problem with both of these, cadence and perceived effort and heart rate, is they're probably only really going to kick in about here on the hill, yeah? Because to start off with, it takes a while, doesn't it? You get a lag before your heart rate really responds. Likewise, you kind of feel alright at the start of the hill. And suddenly as you get up the hill, you go, oh my God, I'm dying. And likewise, cadence, because you've carried a bit of momentum into the hill, you're right for a bit, bless you. So those are actually kind of lagging indicators, which is the problem. And that's why people love power. So people who love power because it is absolutely instantaneous. So what happens on power is you're trucking along at whatever power it is, that you might be going along at the flat. And then obviously as you start to push harder, you will see that absolutely immediately as you push harder into the hill. So absolutely track the hill. And then when you get to the top and you start to freewheel, it drop immediately, because you normally measure it on 3 second. Depends how fast you like it, but you can do 3 second or 30 second or whatever. So you're seeing very fast responsiveness. and then you'll see it kind of come back up. So the people who love power, this is why they really love it. So I don't know whether you've ever heard this story about you have matches to burn. Has anybody ever heard that? Yeah? So the story in cycling is that most people can go deep into the red zone, probably somewhere between 5 and 9 times. It seems to be biological. It seems like even the pros don't manage to train it. They can go into the red for longer, but they can't go into the red more times than when they first started training. So kind of it seems that you get to this kind of thing. So once you know, like, I can broadly only burn about 6 matches, what power can tell you is, I just burned a match. Oh dear. Okay, I'm going to back off that really quickly because it's really going to hurt, and I'm going to really keep watching, because further into the ride you might get to the stage where you're like, I've burnt 4 matches. If I'm having a bad day, I might not even have a 5th. I don't know how my body is today. So that's why people who love power, because it is incredibly responsive, incredibly useful real time. And for people who are all about pacing, it's super useful. So if you're a time trialer, for instance, you haven't got somebody else to follow, you're not racing anything other than the clock and yourself. And so it's all about controlling your effort. Likewise, people who are doing the hour record and so on, power measurement there is super useful because it's incredibly useful, incredibly accurate. It's also used a lot by ultra runners, so there's a running equivalent that you can use that many people train with, and that also includes wind resistance as a part of the measurement. And so that's another reason, if you like, why this can be really useful, is you may have the wind at your front, which obviously changes exactly how much power you have to put in versus the wind at your back. So that's a little bit of the story, if you like, of why people might choose different things out on the road. But let's have a little look and just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what they are. So have people come across the rate of perceived exertion scale before? No? So this is a really simple scale. This is my version of kind of Jenny's face is like, number 1, oh yeah, rocking it. In fact, probably just lying around, sleeping, watching TV, very easy. Then you get into 2 to 3, which is something you can maintain for hours, you can breathe, you can carry a conversation. So this is kind of chatty, like when you first kind of head out and it's downhill and it's all good. Then you start to get to that bit, when you've just gone across the traffic lights and you start to climb up, and the person in the front, holding their wheel, gets a bit harder, and the conversation suddenly starts to reduce dramatically. That's when we're into moderate activity. So it's still okay. We're not kind of terribly out of breath here, but it's definitely more challenging, and we're definitely not having full conversation. We could probably say a sentence like, oh, don't forget to turn right, or whatever. You probably can't have a full chat. And then you get up to vigorous activity, and this is where you're definitely breathing through your mouth by now. You really can't speak a sentence. You can probably say a word or 2 words if you really have to get a message across, but this is like it. And then you get to the very top end where it all starts to go very badly wrong. And this is where you get system things, particularly runners, for instance, will throw up at the end. There are many cyclists actually as well who will throw up just because the amount of acid in the stomach, around the stomach, is just all needs to come out. So that's when you get to those very high levels of effort. So once you get used to kind of using this, because we're all relatively bad, I'm fine, no, I'm not fine. But when you get used to kind of this graduation, particularly the talk test as they call it, and the breathing test, then you can actually do this quite well, and you can absolutely measure your rides of how many times did I get to the stage that I couldn't keep chatting, how many times did I get to the stage where I could only say 2 words, and that will give you a sense of the relative levels of exertion. But if you go to the next level of science, it would be getting into heart rate, and heart rate monitors, much better. You can get them on the watch, so it's like I've got the little flashing lights off the wrist like that, so that will give you ongoing heart rate data. It's okay. It's not 100% accurate, and it seems to be more accurate for people who have pale skin, people who have more tan skin, because I think it's done on kind of the contrast between your vein as it goes through the skin, but much more accurate if you use a heart rate monitor. And whether you use a Wahoo or a Garmin, they just clip on around the chest, and they've just got little sensors in the strap here that will pick it up. And you know, you'll see pretty much all of the pros wear these all of the time. Yeah, it gives you a lot of useful data. Even if you're not going to look at it at all on the ride, it tells you a lot afterwards about what you've put your body through, and that can be really, really useful. So I would strongly recommend to people, if you're serious about wanting to get better and looking at your data, then definitely worth 15, 18 quid, maybe a bit more for one or two of the brands, but a heart rate monitor strap. And you can then do very structured training on an indoor bike with a heart rate monitor, and you just move between the different zones. And so you can get to your maximum heart rate in a couple of different ways. There are some calculation methods, there are some test methods, and then you just work off percentages, and it will constantly give you that. You put it into whether you just have the Garmin app on your phone, or whichever app you use. Fitbits will do it. I think the Apple Watch does it even. So this is a very accessible way to train, and you can really get huge value out of it. So this is where I say, this is where you can save yourself 600 quid for sure. You can get 90% of the benefit of power training with this. And I would suggest that most people don't use heart rate training enough, and could get a lot of useful insights from it. Also, not overloading yourself, because I think particularly as we get older and we need more time to recover, there's times when we really need to go out and just ride in zone 2 and kind of go, oh yeah, nice and easy. I really didn't burn matches today, because every time you burn a match, the body does just need that bit of extra time to recover. It's kind of only fair, isn't it? Kind of taking the money out, the money's got to go back in. But here we go. We will just talk a little bit about power, because it is the thing that people talk about, isn't it? And this is at the velodrome. You can see this guy managed to do 2008 watts, which is boggling. And his maximum heart rate was 188 beats per minute. I mean, it's just that is an unbelievable amount of power. I mean, if you look at our female track cyclists, I think Laura Kenny's maximum power is about 1200 watts, maybe 1100. So, yeah, this is just a lot of power. What power basically is a measure of strength through time. So it's a combination of the speed and the power that you're putting through the pedals. And it can be measured, as I say, in a couple of ways. It can be measured at the pedal, so that's closest to your foot. It can be measured in the crank, and it can be measured in the hub. So there are different places that it can be measured, and they have kind of different pros and cons. But you can, and they're very different prices as well. So, and obviously, if it's the crank or the hub, then it's integral to the bike and the bike build. So those are kind of your options. And you might have bought a bike. Somebody was telling me the other day they bought a bike and happened to have a power crank, and they're like, "Oh, cool! Oh, there we go! Ta-da! Yeah, how exciting! So this can be really useful for you." And then those of you who do Zwift and so on, you may have seen things like this on your Zwift power profile. And so this will be telling you what your average watts is, and because it's got your body weight, it'll give you watts per kilo, which is a good indicator of how fast you'll go, basically. That's the way that the Zwift calculation is done. So on every ride, it'll give you your average watts, and it'll give you watts per kilo for all of them, and then there's your categorizations, which are based on your watts per kilo. So that might be a look that you've seen. And then likewise, you might see this, which is the classic power curve. So depending on which software you use, you'll see a power curve where this is time across the bottom and this is watts. And so it's about how much you can put out over time. And then that is, again, a bit like heart rate broken into zones, and you'll see that. So that's a classic look of a power curve. And I was just going to explain for a minute why everybody will follow a curve like that. Like, some people's will be much higher, some people's might be steeper and different shapes, if you like, in terms of, but it'll always be a curve. And the reason behind that is the way that the body works, because basically there's 3 energy systems that you've got. So one is the Usain Bolt type sprinter, or if you think of a track sprinter, a Chris Hoyce type of sprinter, and that is like really short duration. And that's where if you have gone to the gym and lifted a really heavy weight, or done a sprint for, say, 8 seconds and then had a bit of a break and then done another one, the third one you're like, it's gone. And that's because you burned all of that first system. And so it's the way the energy is transmitted is a particular way, but it's really short duration. Then you get into the anaerobic system, where unfortunately there's not enough oxygen to keep burning all of the carbohydrates and so on properly. And so you can keep going for longer, but unfortunately there's a cost, and particularly if you ever feel the burn, then a lot of that is from the lactate or the hydrogen ions in the lactate that's coming from the fact that you haven't been able to actually fully use the fuel, and that's the aerobic system. So if you can keep it a nice steady intensity for a long time, keep burning the fuel in a really oxidative way, nice and steady, that's that system. So that's why these three systems will always define humans, will always have power curves that look like that. So you don't really need to know that science, but you kind of do need to know that it's unchangeable. And the bits that are useful within it are these points where it curves in particular. And so you can do testing, like at Loughborough University do it, or more locally, the one up at Teddington, they can actually put you in a lab like this with a thing on your face, and it's measuring oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then they'll keep pricking your finger and doing tests on your blood and so on, in order to understand your lactate curve. But the good news is that there are ways to simulate this test and get a pretty good definition of where these two turn points are. And the one that everyone gets particularly focused on is this thing called functional threshold power, FTP, which, have you ever heard anyone talk about? Yeah. And it becomes a kind of a defining number in cycling. And there are normally kind of two major ways that people test. Which way do you test?
Ramp test now.
Ramp test, yeah.
I always used to do the hour test and then
The hour test.
move to 20 minutes.
To the 20 minute.
And then I'll sick a few times with that, I'll just go ramp. It's 1 minute of hell and then
1 minute of hell.
you know,
Yeah.
it feels good, you're over the edge.
So let me talk you through. So the idea is the functional threshold power is the maximum power that you can hold for 1 hour. And the reason that's useful is it sets up that point on the curve really accurately. And from that you can then calculate all of the zones. So the classic test is to ride for an hour. Holly is very strict, her athletes ride for an hour. And it is the purest and the most accurate way. The bit that's hard is there is a lot of psychology in it, because when you ride for an hour at your threshold, you're kind of hallucinating by the end, aren't you? It's not pretty. I mean, really not pretty.
And you almost set yourself a goal beforehand and almost ride to that.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to go over it and not be able to finish, or literally at 52 minutes fall off your bike. So you've almost already decided what you're going to achieve, and then you get to the last 2 minutes and you think, oh, actually, I've still got
A bit more left.
I've still got a bit more left, but it's not. You haven't got time now to bring that up.
To bring it back.
So they do
'Cause it's
sort of
an average.
take. The more you've done them, I think, then, but they're not pleasant.
They're not pleasant. So, and the downside, if you like, is that it does take time to recover, doesn't it? If you ride an hour at threshold, you need at least kind of 2 days, I would say, to start to feel even vaguely okay again. So you do lose time, and if you're doing threshold testing every month, which would be common for a serious cycling schedule, you're just constantly losing recovery time. So that's why a lot of people use one of these other tests. The 20 minutes test is obviously just a shorter version. You then take a percentage of it, and so it's a kind of a fudge. For people who really, 20 minutes is, they hate testing and they really won't do it for the psychology reasons, then they'll tend to do 2 times 8 minutes, and there's another calculation. Or the other one that's very common in Trainer Road and I guess Swift as well, is the ramp test. And basically what it does is it ramps the resistance every 2 minutes, is it, 3 minutes? And you get to the stage where you can't keep your cadence and can't keep turning the pedals, can you?
Yeah, you literally feel like, oh, this is okay. And actually within 2 or 3 minutes you go from it being okay to actually, this really isn't okay to out.
Yeah, done.
Out. Yeah. But I think for some people, I mean, I can overperform the ramp test, to be fair.
Yes.
My 1 minute power is obviously relatively good, but I couldn't maintain that for an hour. Even with all the accurate deductions taken off, it's still probably 10% over, I would say, what the FDP.
And that's why Holly will never work with ramp tests, as an
Yeah.
example. She's just like, it's too inaccurate.
I would concur with that, because
Yeah.
then when I set training on Swift,
based
using
on
this FTP,
It's on
I'm like, flip, I'm having a bad day yet again.
Yeah, and you're not. That is the problem. So the benefit of ramp test is you can ride the next day, or even ride after it. Yeah, I mean normally a ramp test is hard, but if you take a couple of hours, you can go and do another ride. It doesn't kind of impact your training very much, but it's really not very accurate. So I have to admit, I always use a 20-minute test. I'm not quite as pure as Holly. I really don't like the ramp test for the reasons you say. And the bit that I'm really worried about is people having a functional threshold power that they, isn't theirs. Whether that's because they don't want to update it and they've kind of not really been training enough recently, but they're still wedded to the fact that I'm a 180 watt person or a 260 watt person.
To believe the good news, and if it says
if it goes down, it's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so often, if you're indoor training, then often actually doing one of the individual time trials or a race will actually give you a far better, because
just what I was going to
it's
say.
over a long distance and you're sort of distracted, to be fair, so it takes away the psychology horrificness from it.
And so back to the point is it is just a point on that curve, right? If I find the right slope, it is just a point on that curve, and so it really doesn't matter. But it does matter if you're training in the wrong zones. So I always say to people, it's just a number. It doesn't matter if it goes up or down. It is what it is, and we'll work with it. But the point is that it's accurate for you right now, or as accurate as we can get. So from that, if we just, how often? I would say when you've done a reasonable training block, which is somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks if you're training three or four times a week.
And sometimes it might depend on what you want to, what you're training for. If you're training to increase power, then you probably would do it every 4 weeks. I'm training to increase endurance. It's less, that FTP is not actually, I don't actually want it to go up. I actually just want to be able to hold something for longer, so I'm not looking for that final figure to actually be increasing, just my overall fitness to be increasing. So sometimes it depends what if you want to be a track athlete, it needs to go up. If you want to run a marathon, it's less important.
Very true. And that goes back to, doesn't it, what are we training? What does success look like? What should we be measuring? In FTP, you only need to adjust it if it's affecting your training zones and therefore affecting your outcome. But this would be, say, a sheet I just keep by my trainer, so I have my FTP, and I always like to have a bit of a target to chase. So at the time I was chasing a 5 watt target, so at the time I was 240 watts, which I'm not anymore, and I was chasing 245, and then that sets up all my zones. I would spend quite a lot of time working in sweet spot because I wanted to do work that would set me up to do the big ride I'm doing this summer is the Raid Pyrenean. So you're going to climb 8%, 10% hills for 2 hours at a time, up the Tourmalet and so on. So being able to sit in sweet spot for an hour or a couple of hours is quite important. And then I also use it to do a structured warm-up, so I would warm up through each of the power zones to make sure that my body's really ready for the session. So that would just be my kind of little prompt sheet that I could look at. But depending on your setup, it will also give you all those percentages as well. So you can either look at the raw power number in watts, or you can look at the percentages, whichever you want. Or you can, of course, just follow a preloaded program that is actually using this and hopefully training you in the right zone for your goals. But that, I think, doesn't cover this bit around pedalling effectiveness, which goes back to where we were. Gear changes and pedalling are really, really important, and this is why I do love the watt bike, big time. And so I don't know whether you've ridden a watt bike, right? Yeah? How many people have ridden a watt bike? All right, good half. So the watt bike gives you these little kind of pieces, and this is where, when Rachel put in the chat, you need to work on your peanut, this is what she was talking about, because this is known in the trade as elephant balls, and then this is known as the peanut. And what this tells you is where in the quadrant are you putting the power through. So if we think of how I was taught to ride as a kid, where you stood a lot and you stamped on the pedals, then you will get this kind of output, because you're not putting very much power in across the top, but you're putting loads of power in from 3 o'clock down to 6 o'clock. And that's primarily where your power is coming in the stroke. And so that's what this picture is telling you. And then as you use your glutes and your hamstrings more to push over from that kind of 1 o'clock, ideally even from the 12 o'clock position, definitely from 1 o'clock, then you'll start to open it up and start to get to the peanut. So that, it'll give you a pedaling effectiveness score. It's called a PEF, it'll come up on the screen somewhere here, depending on exactly your setup. But you constantly can chase that, which again is just a great kind of piece that across the winter can really help. The other bit that's really useful is you get your left-right balance, and this is where that question of should I buy 2-sided power pedals or 1-sided? Yeah, most people will have a slight kind of left and right variation. They say up to 3% is nothing to worry about, but it can be a lot worse than that. So one of the people that I was coaching she'd fallen on a trail, broken her ankle, and she was in plaster for 6 weeks. When she came out the other side, there was quite a lot in terms of the muscle and so on that had been quite damaged actually. So if we think back to when David was talking about that overhead squat test, when she did it, her knees literally knocked. Because the whole kind of movement pattern around her hip stability and so on had really changed. And how we saw that on the bike, as you can see, they weren't opposite each other anymore. They should have been, but they weren't. So you get the angle of attack here, and you should be in the kind of this zone. And so you can see this foot, she got it back into the place it was, but this one wasn't right at all. And so we were constantly working to address that, and actually the watt bike was a much more effective way of us using it. So this is a second session a month later, a month after that one. So you can see over a month with strength training and so on work, we'd started to make progress, but we weren't there. And we would keep working on this, and this was just our way of having another test, because there's a time in the gym where you kind of go, yeah, I know that my knee still comes in, but how much? And is it better than before? This gave us a very quantified piece of being able to work out their left-right balance and the angle of attack. So I love the watt bike personally. I think it, again, if you go to a gym and they've got it there, you can just have a little app on your phone. It's free, you sign in for an account and it'll give you, and it'll keep all your workouts, you can compare them all. I find it doesn't change much quicker than a month, even if you work relentlessly on it. So that's why I'd say don't buy left and right power pedals. If you're going to buy power pedals or a power crank, just get one, because it'll give you your overall power. The balance between the two is pretty much always going to be approximately what it was last month. But if you really want to look at it, then the watt bike is the place to go, and you can definitely get a lot of value out of the pedal effectiveness. And hopefully for many people who've got gym memberships, that's 100% free. That's good news. Brilliant, so that is all of the stuff around power, but I just wanted to make one particular point, since it's an all-female group, is that most training programs are written for men and written for men in their 20s, because that's kind of the group that most coaching is designed for, and it really doesn't take account of the fact that the female cycle is really different, and it makes us behave differently. It makes the body, for instance, in that luteal phase, after ovulation we tend to be a bit hotter, we therefore need a lot more fluid, we burn more carbs, for instance, in that phase. So the reality of this for everybody is that it's different for every single person, but knowing what it is for you and knowing how to work with it is really useful. And if you are going to go into structured training, the general view these days is that it's really useful to sync your 4 weeks with how you feel in your cycle. So for instance, if you feel really rubbish from about 2 or 3 days before your period starts to a few days after, then that'd be a really good time to have your deload week or recovery week, as it's often called. But you need to kind of work through. And then once you're starting to get into perimenopause, when anything can happen, you probably want to be on a very different cycle, and definitely want to be on a 2 week and then 1 week deload, so a 3 week cycle. And you definitely want to be being really kind to yourself and working out what your body's telling you and what's right for that time. So these are some apps that I think are really useful. I really like wild.ai. You can set up a free account and it helps with tracking. It'll give you lots of intel. Fitter Woman is another one that's also very good. I just prefer Wild myself, and then there's Balance, which is another one. But definitely writing down how it works for you and keeping records, because none of us remember very well, is really useful, and I would definitely recommend it.
What about postmenopause?
Yes, postmenopause.
Yeah.
So here we are, postmenopause, we're obviously into that stage where the good news is, unlike perimenopause where everything's all over the shop and different months can be wildly different from each other, we're into an ongoing steady state, but it's not necessarily an easy steady state, because the estrogen and the progesterone that have helped us so much with this lovely kind of interweaving cycle like the sun and the moon are no longer doing that. They're both very low levels, and so that can affect very much how we metabolise, how we lay down weight, and all of those pieces. So yeah, there's definitely
That includes strength as well.
Yeah, strength is one of the key bits for right from kind of as we start to get into perimenopause, but definitely in postmenopause. And the bit I guess that is really challenging is we definitely need to increase the amount of protein, because the protein demands, in order to cope with the sarcopenia, the loss of muscle and more, and we need to be making sure that we get that in across the day. And often people in this stage, because weight gain is really pretty much universal through it, tend to cut down on calorie intake, and often don't have very much protein at breakfast, for instance, and maybe not even much at lunch, and so it's a lot of protein at the end of the day, but not through the day. So good intakes of protein, they recommend between 20 and 40 grams at every meal, and spacing it out nicely through the day. And definitely post-ride, we really should be getting some protein in a 4-to-1 ratio of carbohydrates to protein, because that then, if it's in the first 30 minutes, it gets kind of sucked straight into the muscles, and then helps rebuild all those little micro tears that happened through the exercise. So yeah, we do. Whereas we might got away with it when we were a bit younger, we're not getting away with it anymore, is the bad news. Hard stuff, yeah. But yeah, we're hoping to get somebody to come and talk a whole session about this, because there's so much cool stuff, and just recently there's been some really good science around the exercising over 40-year-old woman that can be really good. So I think we're on the case on that, aren't we? We've got a couple of options, which is really good news. Great. So this then comes on to what you put on your computer. And I mean, depending how big your screen is, this is probably one of the biggest ones with the Wahoo, but this might not be an unusual size screen. You can't get all of that data on that in a way that you can respond to real time in a ride. And so I think it's really important to work out what is it that is actually going to change how you ride, and then just focus that amount of data onto it. So if, for instance, you are going to look at heart rate during the ride, then that does need to be on your front screen. I don't know what you're going to do when you look at your heart rate in the middle of a ride, other than go, yeah, it's really beating, I knew that.
Particularly such flashing red.
Yeah. So RPM might be really useful to have on your front screen. But calories, who cares about calories on your front screen? I mean, it's just a really bizarre thing to have on your front screen. So I would just say, get really disciplined about what information you're going to respond to in the ride, and get that on your computer, and get it big enough that you can see it, because most of us have lenses and, you know, kind of maybe those little rims across the bottom of our glasses so that we can see what the computer says as well as see the road. But it is useful to have data. So we were talking about cadence as a data point is probably really useful. Heart rate, don't know. Calories, I don't think it's any use at all. And then speed, if I'm really honest, I don't know. Useful to look at after the ride, maybe. Fun to talk about what your maximum speed was after the ride, but I don't know.
To shout at the person in front.
Yeah.
They're going too fast.
Brilliant. But after the ride, I think it's super useful. So I was just going to show you a couple of examples of post-ride analysis to look at some data that might be helpful. So this is the Dinton Pastures cyclocross when Sarah and I were there last summer. And this is my piece. So you can see I didn't have the power pedals on that day. It's my cross bike. And so you've got in red the heart rate data, so that's beats per minute, and then the grey bit is the gradient around the course, and then the green is the speed. So really all I'm looking at here for cyclocross is, did I start hard enough? Did I maintain it, or did I tail off? Because cyclocross is a full out threshold effort for 45 minutes or 47 minutes, I think it was. So you're just looking to get out there. You probably do have some times of over threshold. But broadly, so that was all I was really looking at here is, did I go hard enough, or did I hold back? And did I tail off dramatically, which would tell me that I hadn't paced it correctly. And if we look at it, I'm relatively happy that I held my heart rate pretty much at threshold for most of the race. I guess my criticism would be, I think I could have pushed a bit harder on some of the inclines. There were some inclines around the back. And so I think I might have held back a bit. I didn't feel quite as knackered on this one as I had on the Hillingdon one, so that kind of tells me I probably didn't do as much over threshold as I probably should have done. But that would be my post-ride analysis. I don't know if there's anything else that anybody would take out of that data.
I'd be proud of that.
Proud of it.
That's very straight.
Very straight.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then we'll have a look at a road ride. So So this is the Ride London 100, which I did do with Power, as you can see in the pink, Sue and I rode. And I have my computer set to auto lap every 5 kilometres, so I get a 5 kilometre split as I go along. So it just bleeps at me and shows me the 5 kilometre split, and I broadly know what I want my 5 kilometre split to be when I'm riding long distance. So here you can see I've got cadence data in the orange, power data in the pink, and again kind of incline, although that makes it look much hillier than it is. It's a pretty flat course. Yeah, it's only up to 100. So that's metres of climb, and oh sorry, I haven't switched on these three. I should have. So if I've just clicked on that, it would have showed you the speed as well. But that gives you a little sense, and then you can see in my splits it's got all of the things here, so average heart rate, max heart rate, average speed, max speed, cadence, elevation, work, calories, and then some of these other things that are intensity factors and normalised power and so on that you can use in total stress score if people are monitoring that. So that would be my Ride London 100. So what's your reaction to that now, seeing kind of what power pedals give you? Yeah, just set it to auto lap. Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you notice is I did quite a lot of freewheeling. I think Sue might have worked quite hard, actually. There are a few of the photos where it's like, oh, Sue on the front again, oh, Sue on the front again, Sue on the front again. My excuse was I was training at the time for the Cambridge Grand Fondo, and I wanted to see whether I could still race in the last like 10 miles, and so my goal was to sit in the group and then spread it towards the end, and so this is why this is quite useful at kind of 5 hours. I wanted to see whether I was still putting out the same kind of power that would help me, and same maximum power, so you can see someone on maximum power in that last half an hour. I was still managing to put out 500 watts, 530 watts and so on, which I was quite pleased about. So I'm like, okay, broadly sets me up for what I wanted to do when I was in Cambridge. So that's my excuse, but the reason is
say after 5 hours you're doing 500 watts.
Well, oh yeah, maximum. Bear in mind, I won't be for very long. I mean, my average is 185, 175. Yeah. So yeah, but that's why I say power gives you some useful data, but it's kind of it's quite lumpy, and you've got to know what you're looking for within it. So if I just now show you some of the structured training sessions, so I thought this would be really useful, because to me this is where power is very useful, and you can use your kicker or watt bike or whatever to do this. So this is an example of a warm-up and then some sweet spot intervals. So again, we've got power in pink, heart rate in red, and cadence in yellow.
Sorry, Jenny,
Yeah.
can you just clarify sweet spot?
Yes, sorry, yes. Sweet spot is just under threshold, so it's between 88 and 95% of threshold. And the idea is that you can hold it for quite long durations without feeling absolutely rinsed. Whereas if you hold a threshold, you feel quite unwell quite quickly. So it's just that's why they call it sweet spot, is it's higher than tempo, which would be kind of
so it's
good hard work.
between what zones 4 and 5.
Yeah, and some people even have it depending which set of ranges you use. So if you use the Coggan 6 set of zones, then it's between zone 4 and 5, I think. And if you use the 7 one, I think it's known as 5A or 5B. So it's basically that just under threshold. It's just quite a nice place to sit. So yeah, for instance, as I say, when I ride all the climbs in the Pyrenees, my goal will be to sit in sweet spot, and that's why I will ride with the power meter in the Pyrenees, is to make sure that I'm not accidentally straying into threshold or over threshold, and I'm just sitting, for an hour, an hour and a half. Yeah, and likewise when we did the Kilometre Collective, I sat in sweet spot for the hour. That was my goal. And so you can just sit in there, and it just means you go slightly slower up the hills, slightly faster on downhills and whatever. But you compensate that with gear and cadence. Yeah. So
Depends if you run out of gears.
yeah. Well, you can at the top end. You definitely run out of gears, and the bottom end. To be fair, yeah, I'll definitely run out of gears on the tournament, even with different gearing. So if we were critiquing this, there's some things I really like about this set of sweet spot intervals. Is you can see that the heart rate in the red is just nicely responding. You can see that lag that we talked about, so the power goes straight up and the heart rate lags a bit and comes up nicely. You can see that the intervals are getting harder because the absolute peak in the red is getting higher, and that's the cardiac drift across it. But it's not a horrible cardiac drift, it's a bit, and I would hope that if this person did this session kind of 2 or 3 weeks in a row, you'd see less cardiac drift as the body got acclimatised to that amount of training in it. The other bits, though, this is raw data, so this is not on the erg. So literally they're having to spin and choose their power output, and because I like people to do their intervals like that, it's much harder, but it teaches the body how to sit in the right zones. And so here, I think they're maintaining it relatively well. You could argue they're a bit lumpy, but they are at least maintaining it, so you're not seeing a big drop off, because in a minute we'll start to see examples of intervals where they start well at the zone and then like the power's not quite staying in the zone over time. So I think that's a good set of intervals, and I mean you could argue they could keep their cadence a little bit higher on the recoveries, but it's a relatively good set. Sorry, those are VO2 max intervals. These are sweet spot intervals. So that was when you're right over threshold. That's why they're about how long are they? Yeah, 2 minutes. So that would be a classic over and under set where you do over threshold really hard for 2 minutes, and then you recover for 2 minutes, and you're teaching the body to get rid of the lactic acid in that time. This is a long set of sweet spot intervals, so what we're doing from about 15 minutes to 45 minutes. So yeah, 2 lots of 30 minutes of sweet spot with what looks like a 5-minute recovery. And this is a bit lumpier, yeah. I mean the heart rate is good. Again, not very much cardiac drift over the 2 30-minute intervals in the red. But there's some quite definite dropouts in the power. Yeah, they should be in this light blue zone to really stay tightly in the power zone. So the accuracy of staying in the zone is not so good. So I don't know whether there's.
Were these done inside?
Yeah.
These done indoor training?
Indoor training, yeah, but you're on a free wheel, so it's.
So do you think that's down to their gear choice more than their?
Or concentration, to be honest. my hunch is that they were watching something on telly at the same time, not watching the numbers. That's my hunch. But other than that, and then you can see the cadence drop as well. That one there, the big cadence drop. So I just think there's a bit of attention there about keeping cadence up, and the speed would have stayed, and the power would have stayed. But overall, good set of intervals. I mean, nice. I'm particularly happy with the cardiac outputs. Then these are some max power intervals. So here you can see a nice ramp warm up where they're kind of ramping up through the power. Then you can see some nice activation of high speed cadence drills. So you can see the nice on the yellow, the cadence spikes and the power spikes that go with it. And this one I kept the left and right sensors in, so you can see if you have two-sided pedals that you can see both sides, which doesn't add anything, right? So back to what I'm saying, don't spend the money on two-sided, it really doesn't tell you anything. And then they're doing, I think these are 5-second or 10-second intervals. So you can see the 10-second spike and then the heart rate. And then you can just start to see the pace of recovery by this last interval. If you look at how wide that red one is, it's quite a bit wider than back here, so it looks like about 20% increase in recovery time on that one. So definitely by that last interval, I think they were absolutely whacked. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, I think number 9 they were done. The heart rate would say that. But the bit I'd just like to see a bit more accuracy on is in terms of the power. You can see they hit the power each time quite nicely, or overhit it, I think, actually at the start, compared with what they need to. But they don't maintain it all the way through, so I'd like to see a much squarer thing across the duration, which is a really hard ask, yeah, because you're asking them to get to power and hold it for the duration, but this person is overshooting quite dramatically on some of them, undershooting on others, but then you can see all of them have got this little kind of slopey top, so ideally you want to get to that, and that's showing you that you can hold the power across the duration. So those are the kind of things that you'd look at in it, and just help to fine-tune all those skills that we talked about earlier, yeah, because cadence would have fixed this one. My hunch here is that a little bit more cadence and perhaps a little bit more psychology, because I think short sprint intervals are a lot about what's in your head as you go into it would help. And here you can see a nice bit of cardiovascular training that's kind of coming through. So that would be post-ride analysis. And then the last bit I was going to say, back to the power curve, is it changes. So if you look at quarterly or annual analysis of power, I just took my data just to share with you. You don't keep it, unfortunately, so you probably remember I massively reduced my cycling from the middle of last summer in order to start to try and run again as a big focus. And so I went from riding 5 times a week to once a week, more or less. And with it, you saw my power, my FTP drop from 247 to 189, which is really normal. It's just like, that's what happens when you don't train. But what's interesting actually is you can see that my peak power dropped from just under 500 to about 405. No, here we go. 490 to 385 in terms of peak power. So it comes and goes with your training, and that's the bit I would always say to people is don't get hooked up on a number. It's just a number, and it's whether it actually helps me to climb the hills or change gear more smoothly or all of those things that's really important. And that's why I get really stressed when I hear people saying, oh, I'm going to grow back into my FTP, I'm going to keep it what it was, I'll get back there. It's like, it's really unfair on your body to do that. You've got to train from where you are. So, in summary, things to watch with power meters. If you buy a power meter, there is a power drop-off across transmission. So if you use power pedals, you definitely get a higher power number than you do on a hub or on your Wahoo, and I know that. And so it might give your ego a great stroke to use the power pedals and get a higher number, but it's just a measurement thing, because obviously all through the transmission there's a power drop-off. So it doesn't matter, but just train with one of them, because it's just about training zones, yeah. It doesn't really mean anything. They do need loads of calibration. They're really temperature dependent, and so if you train one day, say I have mine in an outdoor kind of, it's not a shed, is it? That'd be harsh. A palace, but it's an unheated palace. But if the sun's shining through the window and it's relatively warm in there, the calibration will be way different to when it's evening and it's cold. So you do need to calibrate them regularly, and so do spin downs on your Wahoo and your Zwift and so on, because temperature is just massive, and also they're very sensitive to movement as well, if they're the kickers and so on. They do vary, and so different sensors will read differently. So don't think that you can ride one thing and then ride another thing and compare the numbers. It doesn't really work like that. It talks about temperature. You do also get power dropouts sometimes, and the Garmin pedals have been absolutely notorious for it. They've retrofitted the inside bit, so if you've bought an old set and they haven't got that, then there is a free upgrade to get them retrofitted. And if you buy a reconditioned one, make sure they have had that retrofit in them, because it's not free if you buy them second hand. You have to prove that you bought them new. And they take those little small batteries, like hearing aid batteries, and you put 2 of them in, and they're notorious for just not working very well. And so what you have to do is clean them out with alcohol. There's a whole fix online. Clean them out with alcohol and a cotton bud, and then put a tiny amount of baby oil on each of the connections in order to manage power dropouts. So that's the side piece. But the main bit, I think, is you can lose the wood for the trees in data. So if you're going to use power, know why you're using it. If it's to do very accurate training in order to, for instance, back to our goals, if you want to be faster on the flat, doing regular tempo intervals in that kind of zone 3 and zone 4 area will really help you dramatically ride faster on the flat. Super useful. You could do it also with heart rate, but that's really useful. But know why you're doing it, because otherwise, as you saw in the example of Sue and me on Ride London 100, it's just a load of squiggly lines. So you've got to know why it is. And then don't let your ego get wrapped into the power number, because it really doesn't matter. So, this is the point where we can say, back to you. What are you actually going to do from hearing loads and loads of quite techie stuff tonight? If you go back and look at what you wrote as your goal, what is it from the things that we've talked about tonight where you say, actually that's an insight for me. Is it that you say, you know what, I am going to do something that's structured on a bike, or I'm going to go and use the watt bike in the gym because I really want to look at where the power is in my stroke, or is it that you're going to say, I'm going to wear a heart rate monitor because I quite like to see what's going on and where I'm really training, or because at the end of the day, these are just tools. It's what we do with them and how we look after our body that actually makes the difference. So I'll give you a minute or two to go back to your original goal and have a little think about all the techie stuff we've talked about. And if anybody has any kind of questions linked to that, very happily pick up questions.
Did you say there was a well-London plan?
There is.
My eyes lit up when I
Yes.
when
So
I was like, oh, is there? I must find that.
we have just written the beginner's training plan for the London S600, and just back to that kind of piece. What are we training? What we've said is the key areas for most people, bearing in mind this is a generic plan, is to build overall body strength and riding time to be able to cope with the muscular demands of 100 miles in the saddle, because for many people, back to what we're talking about, endurance beyond 2 hours, it is different. To have the bike handling confidence amongst a large group of riders and groups, because there's a lot of people out on the road that day, even though they're closed roads, there's just a lot of riders. And there'll sometimes be people who give you quite close passes and so on, so just feeling comfortable in that environment. And if you can get Sue to ride in front of you, it's great. Just saying. Sorry, Sue. And then the third bit we put is muscular endurance and cardiovascular fitness to be able to complete 100 miles. And the fourth one is ability to carry, eat and process nutrition and hydration to fuel a long ride. And it is really important. It is. And the reason you need to train it is sometimes there's certain things that just don't sit on your stomach very well. And so knowing what you're going to eat and when you're going to eat and so on is really important. So that's built into the plan. And then the fifth one is making sure you've got enough comfortable kit for a long ride, whatever the weather throws at you that day. Because that's the other thing is when you're in the saddle a long time, things can chafe. Or you just might be too hot or too cold and so on. So those are the things. So that's what the plan is built around. It's got a whole set of kind of pieces around it and explains a little bit about relative perceived effort and the breath test, the torque test, and how that links to heart rate percentages. And then it's got a day-by-day plan based on a Friday ride, a Saturday ride, and then a strength session on Monday, and a session probably on an indoor bike on Tuesday. But you could do the Tuesday one on the road if you really wanted to. So yeah, that plan is being uploaded into the Teams app. It may already be there. Jenny was planning to load it before she went, but if not, it will be there imminently. And it's a 12-week plan, I think. So it starts from the 5th of March. So coming soon to an app near you.
And Jenna, does that include tips on nutrition?
It doesn't, but I was going to do some little video clips and thoughts, and maybe do some little interviews around the club of what people love and so on, because it's very personal.
Some guidance on what to eat, because sometimes I just feel that I've run out of energy because I haven't eaten anything.
You
I
should
don't know when I should be eating
before you
it.
get hungry, right?
I know you should do it before you get hungry, but I don't know when.
Well, straight from, you've got to eat from the first hour, and this is why Ironman's hard, because you're already an hour in the hole because you were swimming and you can't really eat when you're swimming. But yeah, so I would say to ultra runners and long distance cyclists, 20 minutes in I'd be taking the first thing. And how I do it normally is I have a little bleep on my watch. So when it bleeps, it's just like eat. And there are calculations that you can do. They're both the amounts of salt and the amounts of carbs that you need based on a per kilo piece, assuming that you're riding aerobically, which ideally you are. So there's just a simple calculation that you do, you work it out, and then, so for instance for me, it used to be 3 Jaffa cakes and 2 jelly babies an hour.
That sounds good to me.
Was mine. But I mean, once you know the grams of carbs, you can just then work out what do I like. And Jaffa cakes aren't that easy to carry on a ride. Actually, they get a bit squished, but they're great on the stationary bike. So that was when I used to do like 5 hours on the turbo. That would be my loss of imagination.
We're still drinking.
Yeah.
Drinking
Yeah. Yeah, and there are different views on that. Stacey Sims, who's the kind of the guru of, if you haven't read her book Raw, it's definitely
She's got a new
next
one out
level.
called
Next level.
Step,
Yeah, next level. Yeah, it's good.
Post-menopause, it's a good read.
It is. And I've just done her Menopause 2.0 course. She's quite adamant that for women it's much more helpful to take food as solids and liquid for hydration only. So she's quite against the kind of the tailwinds and those kind of things. And she'll explain the biochemistry and the science behind it. But everybody's individual is what I would then go on to say. So it's like, do exactly what's right for you. But if you want a view from a professional, she would say food in the pocket, water in the bottle would be her kind of absolute mantra. But try different things and kind of work it out. But we can do I'll do some little videos across the club of what people do. And also savoury, I have to admit. Sometimes quite like a pork pie on the plate. Just for that. Savoury all the way. Yeah.
Peanut butter and jam. By the time you read it, and 2 hours.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Am I alone, or do other people struggle with nutrition, with the like the gels, and I just can't find a gel that
I never take a gel. I just don't like them.
I used to use gels and I just don't. I use
okay, thank you, I'm not alone in that.
Nice.
That's what they advocate at Henley Road Club. The kids are all told not to buy Tailwind and all of that stuff. It's Ribena, sweetened Ribena, not
Yeah.
sweetened stuff. Half teaspoon of salt, topped up water.
That's
Yeah,
it.
I
So
do
just squash with salt in it.
Yeah.
I just have salt with squash with salt in it.
That's what I have as well. Yeah.
To be honest, it tastes
You can't
like
taste it.
Tailwinds and all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there like drink stops on these long rides?
There are lovely ones, to be fair. Ride London has really nice stops and really nice volunteers and lots of stuff. Yeah.
But they do have cut-offs.
Decided to go and just pick them up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But when we did Ride Birmingham, quite a few years ago, we
Yeah.
started quite late in the ride and we realised
Yeah. So you can be chasing the cut-offs. Yeah. Yeah.
so you have to be conscious of that.
For sure. For sure.
Get away as early as possible.
But yeah.
Yes,
Anything else?
Rest days did you have? Because
Yeah.
I quite like riding as many days as I can, and I know that you should probably build in a rest day, but it's quite hard to, if someone says, oh, go again.
Yeah, it's the agony, isn't it? So how many rest days? I would say when you're training hard, you must have one full day of rest in the week, where you literally don't train. More than that, you psychologically don't think about training. And the reason I say that is when you're on a very structured plan, and I think people see this when they're on marathon training plans as well, it becomes the first thing that you think about when you wake up in the morning. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to do 9-10 second max power until it's like, oh my God, when in the day am I going to feel like I can go that hard? And so you plan your whole day around that. You've got obviously a load of other things going on, but your day is focused on that thing. And it's relentless and tiring and mentally tiring as well. So that's why I think if you're training hard, you've got to have at least one rest day. I have to say, I think as we get older, a number of the athletes I'm training now, men as well as women, absolutely need more rest days than that in the week. And it's really clear that they do need that. And there are also days that they need to take a day when their body just isn't doing it for them today. So I think you've got to build that dialogue with your body to get up and kind of go, okay, we're finding the stairs not 100% easy this morning. That's a sign that maybe there's still a bit of residual exhaustion in the legs. Perhaps ought not to do maximum effort intervals today. So I think that's the piece. The other bit I would say is most of us don't ride in zone. And so ideally, our Friday ride should be a zone 2 ride. I think if you look at how much of the ride is not entirely in zone 2, it tells us, and it's okay, but it just means that really we probably should have 24 hours rest after a Friday ride, because we're riding the Friday ride a bit too hard. And again, when you're young, you can get away with it. You bounce back really quickly. Unfortunately, as we get older, it just isn't like that. I'm just reading a great book at the moment called The Midlife Cyclists and all of the science behind midlife training. Again, written by a bloke, for blokes primarily. And it's very clear his kind of overall mantra is just can't do what you can do when you're young. You can do many of the things, but you just got to put in a lot more recovery time, a lot more care, body care, nutrition care, all that stuff, unfortunately. I wish there was a better answer than that.
How do you know whether your zones are accurate or not as well? I mean, this is the thing. I'm sure my zones on Strava, for example, are not accurate.
Heart rate zones or...
Well, just riding within zone 2 as an example, which I'm using heart rate normally for that to guide me through that. When I'm on the watt bike, I can obviously look at power, but I haven't been training, so I've not been making note of that, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, I've just done an hour here and there. I haven't done any structured training this winter.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, I mean, my zones are set up for when I was probably fitter.
Right. And so what I would always say is, just like your threshold number in power, you should change your maximum heart rate number as well. And so if you've had a long layoff, you'll definitely see it come down. That's really normal. And again, it will come back up again. It's okay. The other bit that to be really careful of is it is sport dependent. So your maximum heart rate in running will be higher than your maximum heart rate in cycling, just because you're lifting your whole body weight every time, every step when you run. And so it's much more cardiovascular. And so you will definitely get a slightly higher maximum heart rate running. So if you want to be very specific about cycling heart rate, then you should really do a cycling test, and one of the great ways to do it would be something the equivalent of a 45-minute cyclocross race or a criterium or something, and that will, you pretty much clearly see, like, okay, that's my maximum heart rate. That's, I mean, there are a lot of calculations, and there are some increasingly accurate calculations based on all sorts of things like age and body fat percentage and so on. So there's some quite clever calculations now, but nothing beats doing a real test, I'm afraid, is the bad news. But in the end, the calculations will probably only be about 4 or 5 beats per minute off, which at the end of the day is not too bad. And if we aim to train in the middle of the zone,
then you're pretty...
Yeah, there's big error margins on all of it, to be honest. So I wouldn't worry too much about accuracy. I'd focus more on, did I really stay in the zone for the ride? And like, for instance, the other day when you and I recce'd, I got back and went, oh, that wasn't quite the heart rate zone that I thought I was going to ride in today. So
we did our best to talk as well, didn't we?
Exactly. So yeah, I'd say being strict with ourselves is probably more of a worry than the absolute accuracy of the maximum. But yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Anything else? No? So I will give you my final takeaways. And then you can write down your big one. So in my view, I would say tonight's been about always start from your goals. Just because somebody else is training for something else and doing something different, and it's the coolest workout on Instagram right now, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one for you. Focus your sessions on that goal. And so, for instance, you know, building endurance beyond 2 hours, if you want to do that, that is going to be a question of working there. There can be smart workarounds. So for instance, that one you might weight train and then ride, for instance, so that you build fatigue in. If you haven't got time to ride a 3rd hour, you might weight train for 30 minutes and then ride a hard ride for an hour and a half, and you'll get some of the kind of endurance implications. Have maximum 2 or 3 measures that you're working on across a 12-week period. Trying to change more things than that is probably impossible. And as we talk, some of the things that most of us can make a really big difference on a cadence and riding in different heart rate zones, but choicefully in those zones. So those can be really useful things. Power can be a useful output measure, particularly when we're training on the turbo. I think it gives us a lot of accuracy, but I really wouldn't buy power pedals necessarily unless you're going to start time trialling or doing long alpine climbs. Heart rate is really, really useful. I guess if there's one thing I really hope you will take away from tonight, it would be we probably all underutilise our heart rate monitors, and most of us can focus more on cadence and improve. And I do love the watt bike. I guess you gathered that. I think there's so much in that kind of pedal stroke that can help. But all of them are only measures, and so it really goes back to what's your plan and what are you getting out of it, and if it's not quite getting you there, then kind of fine-tuning it. So that would be my thoughts, but here we go. It leaves you to think of one thing that you can write on your page to say, I commit to do this to help me get to all that I want. So I'll leave you to have a little ponder on that, and then I think we'll turn the camera off, and then if there are any more questions that people want to ask in a more informal environment, we'll do that.